The easiest arrests are usually the ones that stay with you the longest. The bakery lights glowed warm against the cold blue haze of Colony Sector 9. Fresh steam drifted from rooftop vents and curled into the night air, while cargo shuttles hummed overhead like distant thunder. Officer Ethan Walker stood beneath a transit archway, hands tucked into the pockets of his dark patrol jacket, watching people move through the evening crowd. Workers heading home, families carrying grocery packs, vendors folding up market stalls before curfew. It looked like any ordinary shift, the kind that passed quietly and was forgotten by morning. Then his wrist communicator vibrated. A sharp pulse. A theft alert. Bakery district. Ethan glanced down at the flashing icon. Low-level property crime. One stolen loaf. He almost laughed. 1,000 people crossed the district every hour. Most officers would never leave their post for something so small. But regulations were regulations. Every alert required a response. He acknowledged the call and started walking. The bakery sat 2 blocks away beneath a glowing sign shaped like a wheat stalk. The owner stood outside, waving his arms and speaking rapidly into a security terminal. Ethan approached calmly. What happened? The owner pointed toward a narrow street disappearing between aging apartment towers. Young female, Vayari, grabbed a loaf and ran. Ethan glanced toward the alley. Security footage appeared on his wrist display. The image was grainy but clear enough. A young alien woman with silver-blue skin. Thin frame. Dark hooded coat. She snatched a loaf from the cooling rack and disappeared before anyone reacted. Simple. Straightforward. Open and shut. Yet something felt wrong. Ethan replayed the footage. Then again. The girl wasn't looking at cash registers. She wasn't looking for cameras. She wasn't even looking for a way out. She looked terrified. Like someone racing against a clock nobody else could see. Ethan started down the alley. The city grew quieter with every step. Neon signs faded behind him. The polished commercial district gave way to rusted maintenance tunnels and aging residential blocks. Water dripped from overhead pipes. Ventilation fans rattled somewhere inside the walls. The smell of warm bread slowly disappeared beneath the scent of machine oil and recycled air. Ahead, movement. A figure turned sharply around a corner. Ethan caught a glimpse of silver-blue skin beneath a hood. The girl. He quickened his pace. Not running. Just enough to keep her in sight. She darted through a maze of service corridors connecting older housing sectors. Fast. Desperate. Every few seconds, she glanced behind her. Every glance carried the same expression. Fear. Not of punishment. Not of prison. Fear of being late. Ethan noticed something else. The loaf was clutched tightly against her chest with both arms. Protected from the rain dripping through cracked overhead panels. Protected from everything. Like it mattered more than her own safety. Like it wasn't food. Like it was hope. The chase continued another 100 yards before the corridor opened into a neglected residential zone forgotten by most of the colony. The girl stumbled briefly, caught herself, and hurried toward a weathered apartment entrance. Ethan stopped 20 feet away. His training told him to call out. To identify himself. To make the arrest. Instead, he watched her fumble with the access panel. Her hands shook. The door slid open. Warm light spilled onto the walkway for a single second. And from somewhere inside the apartment came the sound of a child coughing. The girl froze. Her eyes widened. Then she looked back at Ethan for the first time. There were no excuses in that expression. No anger. No defiance. Only fear. Pure fear. She tightened her grip on the loaf and whispered words he barely heard across the corridor. Please, my brother doesn't have much time. The corridor remained silent after the words left her mouth. Ethan stood beneath the flickering ceiling light and watched the young woman through the half-open doorway. Most suspects filled the air with excuses. They argued. They blamed someone else. They ran. This one did none of those things. She simply stood there holding a loaf of bread that had already begun to cool, her breathing uneven from the chase. Behind her, the sound came again. A dry cough. Small. Weak. The kind of sound that seemed too fragile to survive inside a city built from steel and machinery. Ethan slowly stepped forward. The apartment door slid open another few inches. Warm air drifted into the hallway, carrying the faint scent of recycled oxygen filters and old heating coils. The room beyond was barely larger than a storage unit. A folding table stood against one wall. A cracked water recycler hummed quietly in the corner. One overhead light glowed with a dull yellow pulse. brightening and dimming every few seconds as if it were struggling to stay awake. The girl lowered her eyes. "Please," she said again. "I only needed enough for tonight." Ethan glanced at the loaf in her hands, then at the room. There was no hidden stockpile, no expensive equipment, no signs of deception. Every surface carried the same story. Poverty, the kind that settled into walls and never left. The kind that turned every meal into a decision. He looked toward the far side of the apartment. A narrow sleeping platform sat beside a portable heater that appeared older than the colony itself. A child lay beneath a thin blanket. Blue skin, dark hair, small frame, far too small. The boy could not have been older than 10. A medical monitor rested beside him. Its screen flickered weakly. Several warning indicators glowed amber. Nutritional deficiency, elevated temperature, chronic metabolic instability. Ethan recognized the symbols immediately. He had seen them before in hospital reports. Treatment existed. Effective treatment. Expensive treatment. The boy stirred slightly. His eyes opened halfway. He noticed the bread first. Not his sister. Not Ethan. The bread. The expression on his face lasted only a second, but it hit harder than any arrest Ethan had ever made. Relief. Pure relief. As if seeing that loaf meant he would make it through another night. Lyra moved quickly to his side and knelt beside the platform. She tore away a small piece and handed it to him. The boy accepted it carefully, almost reverently. Like something sacred. Ethan looked away. The old ventilation unit rattled above him. Somewhere beyond the apartment walls, a freight shuttle thundered across the night sky. Life continued across the colony exactly as planned. Commerce, transportation, profits, schedules. Yet inside this tiny room, everything revolved around a few ounces of bread. "How long has he been sick?" Ethan asked quietly. Lyra hesitated before answering. "Almost a year." Her voice cracked. "The medication costs more than I earn in a month." Ethan studied the room again. No food containers. No recent deliveries. No signs of waste. Only survival. Only endurance. The patrol tablet hanging from his belt remained active. One touch would complete the report. Theft confirmed. Suspect identified. Case closed. Simple. Efficient. Legal. Ethan rested his hand against the device, but did not move. His eyes settled on the child, taking careful bites beside the dim yellow light. For the first time that night, the stolen loaf no longer looked like evidence. It looked like the difference between despair and tomorrow. The apartment seemed even smaller once the silence returned. The boy had finished the last crumb from his piece of bread and drifted back against the thin pillow. The warning lights on the medical monitor continued their slow pulse across the dim room. Amber, amber, amber. Ethan had spent nearly 15 years enforcing regulations across 3 different colonies. He knew what hunger looked like. He knew what poverty looked like. But there was something different about this place. Nothing here suggested carelessness. Nothing suggested bad choices. Every item had been repaired instead of replaced. Every surface had been cleaned despite its age. The cracked water recycler had been patched with hand-cut insulation strips. The heater had replacement parts from at least 4 different manufacturers. Someone had fought every day to keep this tiny apartment functioning. Someone had refused to quit. Lyra sat beside her brother and carefully folded the empty bread wrapper into a neat square before placing it on the table. Even that small motion carried a kind of discipline. Ethan noticed it immediately. People who had enough rarely thought about waste. People who had nothing learned to value everything. He finally removed his hand from the patrol tablet. The device remained active against his belt, waiting for a decision. Waiting for him to become the officer he had been trained to be. Yet the room kept interrupting that training. The monitor, the failing heater, the exhausted young woman trying to hide her fear, the child whose face had brightened at the sight of a loaf of bread. "What is his name?" Ethan asked. "Nico," Lyra answered softly. The boy managed a small smile. "Hello, officer." Ethan nodded. "Hello, Nico." The child coughed lightly into his blanket. Not severe, not dramatic, just enough to remind everyone in the room that something was wrong. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor. Lines of medical data crawled across the screen. He recognized several treatment codes. Nutritional stabilizers, metabolic supplements, cellular support therapy, standard medications. Nothing experimental, nothing rare. The kind of treatment thousands received every day throughout the colony. When was his last prescription refill? Ethan asked. Lyra looked down. 3 months ago. Ethan frowned. 3 months. She nodded. I kept reducing the dosage so it would last longer. The admission hung heavily in the room. Not because it was reckless, because it was understandable. She had been stretching days into weeks, weeks into months, buying time one impossible decision at a time. Ethan walked toward the narrow window overlooking the maintenance district. Beyond the glass, countless lights covered the colony. Towers, transit lanes, shipping platforms, restaurants, entertainment centers. Millions of credits changed hands every hour beneath those lights. Yet somehow a child could not obtain basic medicine. The contradiction bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Behind him, Nico spoke again. Are you taking her away? The question arrived quietly, without accusation, without anger. Ethan turned. The boy's eyes remained fixed on him, waiting. Ethan suddenly remembered another hospital room years earlier. Another small bed. Another child asking questions adults could not answer. The memory appeared so quickly it stole his breath for a moment. He pushed it away before it settled. No, he said. Not tonight. Relief washed across Lyra's face so quickly she could not hide it. Her shoulders lowered. Her hands stopped trembling. For the first time since he entered the apartment, she looked her age instead of carrying the exhaustion of someone twice as old. Ethan glanced once more at the inactive report screen. One touch would still complete the arrest. One touch would satisfy procedure. One touch would allow him to leave this apartment and forget it existed. Instead, he powered the tablet down. The screen went dark, and for the first time that evening, the choice no longer felt difficult. It felt necessary. For several seconds nobody spoke. The apartment settled into its familiar rhythm. The heater clicked unevenly. The ventilation unit rattled inside the wall. A faint current moved through the damaged window frame, carrying the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond. Ethan slipped the patrol tablet back onto his belt and looked toward the door. Officially, his shift report still contained an open incident, an unresolved theft. An officer was supposed to return with evidence, identification, and documentation. Instead, he stood inside a room that had quietly dismantled every assumption he had made before walking through the doorway. Nico's eyes followed him. Are you leaving? The boy asked. Ethan managed a small smile. For a little while. The child nodded, accepting the answer without complaint. Children often understood more than adults gave them credit for. Lyra rose from the chair beside the sleeping platform. Thank you, she said quietly. Ethan noticed she spoke as though the matter were finished, as though simply not being arrested had already exceeded every expectation she possessed. That realization unsettled him. Nobody should be grateful for basic mercy. Yet here she was, standing in a room without adequate heat, without medicine, without enough food, thanking him for doing nothing at all. He glanced toward the medical monitor again. Amber indicators continued to flash across the screen. The apartment's lighting dimmed momentarily as the aging power grid shifted loads across the district. For an instant the room fell into shadow. Then the weak yellow glow returned. Nico closed his eyes and pulled the blanket closer around his shoulders. The fabric looked far too thin for a colony winter. Ethan reached for the collar of his uniform jacket. The insignia reflected the room's dim light. Silver badge, department crest, authority, responsibility, rules. For years those symbols had guided every decision he made. They had helped him remain objective, consistent, fair. But standing here, the distinction between procedure and justice no longer felt simple. He remembered the academy instructors who taught that laws existed to protect people. Somewhere along the way, many officers forgot the second half of that sentence. They remembered the law. They forgot the people. Ethan removed the badge clip from his jacket. The small piece of polished metal rested in his palm. It was surprisingly heavy. He stared at it for several moments before placing it carefully into his pocket. Lyra watched the gesture without understanding. To her it probably looked insignificant. To Ethan it felt like a promise. Not a rejection of duty. A reminder of why duty existed in the first place. Stay here tonight, he said. Do not go looking for more food. Do not leave him alone. Concern crossed her face. What happens now? Ethan moved toward the doorway. I'm going to ask some questions. About me? She asked. No. He glanced back at the apartment one last time. At the patched heater. The failing monitor. The exhausted sister. The sick child. About why this happened in the first place. Outside, the corridor felt colder than before. The door slid shut behind him with a soft mechanical hiss. Ethan stood alone beneath the flickering overhead lights. Somewhere far above, the prosperous districts sparkled beneath climate-controlled domes. Restaurants served expensive dinners. Cargo ships unloaded luxury goods. Digital advertisements promised comfort and abundance. Yet only a few miles away, a child depended on a stolen loaf of bread. The contradiction followed him as he walked, step after step through the aging corridor. The deeper he thought about it, the less the situation resembled a simple theft report. Because crimes were usually easy to identify, causes were harder. And for the first time that night, Ethan suspected the real problem was not inside that apartment. It was somewhere much higher. The commercial district looked entirely different after midnight. The crowds were gone. Storefront lights reflected across polished walkways like ribbons of gold. Cleaning drones moved silently between empty benches, while digital advertisements continued speaking to an audience that no longer existed. Ethan walked through the quiet streets carrying 2 insulated supply bags. Their weight pulled slightly against his shoulders. It had been years since he purchased groceries for anyone except himself. The realization felt strange. He had stopped at 3 different locations before returning. 1 grocery market, 1 pharmacy, 1 hardware supply kiosk. None of the purchases had been expensive on their own. Bread, fresh fruit, protein packs, bottled water, nutritional supplements, replacement air filters, thermal blankets, a portable heater regulator compatible with older residential systems. Ordinary things. The sort of things most residents never thought about. Yet somewhere between checkout terminals and pharmacy counters, Ethan found himself wondering how many families quietly disappeared behind statistics. How many people survived just 1 missed paycheck away from disaster? A cargo shuttle passed overhead, its engines humming softly against the night sky. Ethan continued walking. The maintenance district greeted him with familiar darkness. Flickering lights, aging corridors, pipes carrying recycled water through walls older than some of the colony's citizens. Nothing here looked prosperous. Yet lights still glowed behind apartment doors. People still lived here, worked here, raised families here. The city rarely noticed them unless something went wrong. When he reached the apartment, he hesitated briefly before pressing the entry signal. Footsteps approached. The door slid open. Lyra stared at him in confusion. Then her eyes dropped to the supply bags. For several seconds, she said nothing. Ethan lifted 1 bag slightly. "May I come in?" She stepped aside immediately. The apartment felt warmer than before, though only by a few degrees. Nico sat upright now, wrapped in his blanket and reading from an outdated educational tablet. His expression brightened when he saw Ethan. "You came back." Ethan placed the bags on the table. "I said I would." The child smiled. A simple thing. Small. Honest. Somehow it changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Ethan unpacked the supplies 1 item at a time. Food covered nearly half the table before he finished. Fresh apples. Shelf-stable meals. Nutrient bars. Medical supplements approved for Nico's condition. Bottled electrolyte solution. Lyra stood motionless beside the chair. Watching. Not touching anything. As though she feared the items might disappear if she moved too quickly. Ethan finally noticed. "They are yours," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. "All of it. All of it." She lowered herself into the chair. For the first time since they met, the exhaustion returned to her face. Not because she was tired, because she no longer needed to pretend she was not. Ethan opened the service panel beneath the heater and examined the regulator assembly. Several components had worn beyond their expected lifespan. 10 minutes later, he installed the replacement unit. Warm air immediately flowed stronger through the vents. Nico stretched both hands toward the heater and laughed quietly. The sound echoed through the apartment like something forgotten. Ethan found himself smiling. While the siblings organized food supplies, he glanced toward the medical monitor again. The treatment codes remained visible. One detail caught his attention this time. Supplier authorization records. Distribution network information. Several recent deliveries listed as completed despite the apartment receiving none of them. Ethan leaned closer. He checked the dates twice. Then a third time. According to colony records, assistance shipments had already been delivered here months ago. Enough to cover medication. Enough to prevent everything he had witnessed tonight. Yet the room around him told a completely different story. Ethan stared at the screen. Somewhere between the official records and this apartment, something was missing. And for the first time, he had proof. The Apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of the repaired heater. Warm air flowed steadily through the vents now, carrying away the chill that had settled into the walls for months. Nico sat at the table eating slowly from a heated meal pack, while Lyra organized supplies into careful rows across a storage shelf. Neither of them noticed Ethan standing motionless beside the medical monitor. His attention remained fixed on the shipment records glowing across the screen. Delivery confirmed. Delivery confirmed. Delivery confirmed. Every entry carried official authorization codes. Every shipment had supposedly reached this address. Yet the room around him contradicted every line of data. The medicine had never arrived. The nutritional supplements had never arrived. The emergency food packages had never arrived. Someone had signed the records. Someone had approved the deliveries. But somebody else had ensured the supplies never reached the people who needed them. Ethan enlarged one transaction, then another. The supplier identification appeared at the bottom of each report. Helix Community Distribution Services. He recognized the name immediately. The company managed assistance programs across nearly a third of the colony's outer districts. Government contracts, medical support, emergency food networks. Publicly praised, politically connected, untouchable, according to most officers. Ethan frowned. Something felt wrong. Not because mistakes happened. Large systems always produced errors. But because there were too many completed deliveries attached to this apartment. Too many missing shipments. Too many months without correction. Is something bad? Nico asked. Ethan looked up. The boy had stopped eating. Concern showed plainly in his expression. Ethan shook his head. I am not sure yet. Nico considered the answer carefully. That means yes. Ethan almost laughed. Maybe a little. The child nodded as if that confirmed everything. Lyra approached the table. What did you find? Ethan turned the monitor toward her. According to colony records, assistance shipments have been delivered here for months. Confusion crossed her face. That cannot be right. I know. Nobody brought anything. Ethan studied her reaction. No hesitation. No uncertainty. She genuinely had no idea the shipments existed. Did anyone contact you about missed deliveries? He asked. She shook her head. No. Any notices? Nothing. The answer settled heavily between them. Ethan returned his attention to the screen. He opened additional records through his department access credentials. More addresses appeared. More delivery confirmations. Some belonged to neighboring apartments inside the same district. Several showed identical patterns. Medical assistance approved. Food support approved. Shipments completed. Yet complaint requests had been filed weeks later by residents reporting shortages. The system marked each complaint resolved without explanation. Ethan stared at the growing pattern. One apartment could be a mistake. 2 apartments might be coincidence. A dozen apartments became something else entirely. Outside the apartment window, distant city lights shimmered against the darkness. Freight traffic moved steadily between sectors. Advertisements flashed promises of prosperity and security. Yet hidden beneath those glowing promises, entire neighborhoods appeared to be disappearing from the records. Not physically, administratively. Their needs existed on paper. Their assistance existed on paper. Their support existed on paper. Reality was different. Ethan closed several reports and transferred copies into a private encrypted archive. Department servers automatically monitored most investigations. For now, he preferred discretion. The fewer people who noticed his questions, the better. Lyra watched quietly. Why are you helping us? She asked. The question caught him off guard. He thought about giving a practical answer. A professional answer. Something simple. Instead, he looked toward Nico eating his first proper meal in days. Because somebody should have. The room fell silent. No speeches followed. No dramatic declarations. Just the sound of warm air moving through the vents and a child finally eating without fear. Yet as Ethan saved the final report, one certainty settled firmly into place. He had come here investigating a stolen loaf of bread. He was leaving with evidence of something far larger. The next morning began long before sunrise. Pale light filtered through the colony's upper dome, turning the distant skyline into a faint silver outline beyond the station towers. Ethan sat alone inside Precinct 4's records division, surrounded by rows of silent terminals and the soft hum of cooling systems. Most officers would not arrive for another hour. That was exactly why he came early. Questions attracted attention. Evidence attracted even more. He preferred working before either had the chance to find him. The encrypted files from the previous night floated across his display. Apartment addresses, shipment logs, assistance approvals, medical records, hundreds of pages of information connected by one repeating pattern. Support allocated, support approved, support completed. Yet residents continued reporting shortages. Ethan expanded the search radius. 10 apartments became 23. 23 became 47. Every district belonged to the same distribution network. Every network connected to the same contractor. Helix Community Distribution Services. By 7 o'clock, a knot had formed in his stomach. Not because the evidence was weak, because it was becoming impossible to ignore. The office doors opened behind him. Voices entered with the morning shift. Conversations. Coffee cups. Routine complaints about schedules and paperwork. Ethan minimized several windows and continued working. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Marcus Reed stopped beside his desk. "You are here early." Ethan nodded. Could not sleep. Reed glanced toward the display. "What are you digging into?" The question sounded casual. Yet Ethan noticed how quickly it arrived. He selected a harmless maintenance report and brought it forward. Old assistance records. Reed stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Then he smiled. "Leave that to administrative review." "Maybe." Reed placed a hand on the desk. That was not a suggestion. The lieutenant walked away without waiting for a response. Ethan watched him disappear into the main office. Something cold settled in the room. Not fear. Recognition. He had spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize warning signs when they appeared. Nobody discouraged an investigation that strongly unless the investigation made someone uncomfortable. 2 hours later, his communicator vibrated. Internal Affairs Division. Mandatory meeting. Immediate attendance requested. Ethan leaned back slowly. The timing was almost impressive. He arrived at the conference room 5 minutes later. A woman from Internal Affairs sat waiting beside a digital recorder. Professional, polite, expressionless. She began asking questions about an unresolved theft report from the previous evening. A missing bakery incident. An unidentified suspect. Missing documentation. Missing arrest paperwork. Ethan understood immediately. Somebody had reviewed his activity logs. Somebody wanted answers. The interview remained civil. Procedure disguised as concern. Why had he left the scene? Why had the report not been completed? Why had surveillance records remained incomplete? Ethan answered carefully, truthfully when possible, briefly whenever necessary. By the time the meeting ended, one message had become perfectly clear. His actions were being watched. When Ethan returned to his desk, a notification waited on his terminal. Temporary reassignment pending administrative review. Restricted database access effective immediately. He stared at the message, then laughed quietly despite himself. 48 hours earlier, nobody cared about a stolen loaf of bread. Now departments were moving with remarkable efficiency. His access was restricted. His investigation discouraged. His decisions questioned. Yet none of those responses addressed the missing medication. None addressed the missing food shipments. None addressed the families still waiting for assistance that official records claimed they already received. Ethan looked through the office window toward the distant city skyline. Morning sunlight now reflected across the upper towers. Beautiful, clean, prosperous. From this distance, everything appeared perfect. But perfection depended on nobody looking underneath. And for the first time, Ethan realized someone was working very hard to make sure he stopped looking. 3 days later, the chamber was full. Rows of elevated seats curved around the central floor of the Colonial Oversight Council like the inside of a great silver amphitheater. Soft white lights reflected from polished walls. Digital displays floated above the audience, projecting testimony records and public documentation for every citizen watching across the colony network. Ethan stood near the rear entrance waiting for the hearing to begin. His suspension remained active. His access privileges remained restricted. Yet none of that mattered anymore. The evidence had already moved beyond internal systems. Independent auditors had reviewed the records. Journalists had started asking questions. Most importantly, residents from the outer districts had finally been invited to speak. The chamber doors opened again. More witnesses entered. Elderly workers, parents, medical volunteers, people who normally never stepped inside buildings like this. Their expressions carried the same mixture of nervousness and determination. They had spent months being ignored. Today someone was listening. Council members took their seats. The proceedings began. Numbers appeared across the public displays. Assistance budgets, delivery records, government contracts, millions of credits allocated for food programs and medical support. On paper, everything looked perfect. Then the witness testimony started. One resident described medication that never arrived. Another described emergency food deliveries marked complete despite receiving nothing. A clinic administrator presented records showing shortages affecting entire neighborhoods. Piece by piece, the polished image began to crack. Ethan watched the council members exchange increasingly uncomfortable glances. The evidence was no longer isolated. It was systemic, a pattern hidden behind successful reports and completed forms. Several executives from Helix Community Distribution Services attempted to defend the discrepancies. Technical errors, communication failures, administrative confusion. The explanations sounded weaker with every witness. Then the final testimony was called. Lyra Vesh. The chamber grew noticeably quieter. Ethan looked toward the entrance. Lyra stepped inside wearing a simple gray jacket and dark trousers borrowed from a community assistance center. She appeared nervous. Understandably so. Hundreds of people watched from the gallery. Thousands more followed through public broadcasts. Yet she continued walking until she reached the testimony platform. The lights above reflected softly against her silver-blue skin. The council chairperson invited her to speak. For several seconds, she remained silent. Ethan worried she might freeze. Then Lyra took a slow breath. "My brother is 10 years old," she began. Her voice trembled slightly before finding strength. "He has a medical condition. We were approved for assistance. We were told support existed. We were told help was coming." The chamber remained perfectly still. But nothing arrived. She described skipped meals, missed medication, endless requests for updates, automated responses, closed complaints, months disappearing while records claimed everything had been resolved. She never exaggerated, never raised her voice. She simply told the truth. Somehow that made every word stronger. A large display screen projected one image beside her testimony. Nico sitting on the edge of his bed beside the aging medical monitor. Small, thin, smiling anyway. The room changed after that. Not dramatically, quietly. Council members stopped checking reports. Reporters stopped typing. Even the executives seemed unable to look away from the image. Because statistics could be debated. Procedures could be defended. But a child was harder to explain. When Lyra finished, silence lingered throughout the chamber. Then questions began. Serious questions. Difficult questions. Questions nobody could dismiss anymore. Ethan remained near the rear wall listening as investigators announced preliminary findings. Missing inventories. Altered records. Misallocated shipments. Financial irregularities extending across multiple districts. The scope exceeded anyone's expectations. As the hearing continued, Ethan looked toward Lyra. She noticed him standing there and offered a small nod. Nothing more. Yet in that moment, he understood something important. She had once stood in a bakery holding stolen bread because nobody would listen. Now an entire colony was listening, and there was no turning back. 1 year later, the bakery smelled exactly the same. Warm yeast, fresh bread, cinnamon from the morning pastries cooling behind the display counter. Steam drifted upward from industrial ovens while sunlight filtered through the glass storefront, painting soft rectangles of gold across the floor. Customers filled the room with quiet conversation. Children laughed near a window table. Delivery workers stopped in for breakfast before beginning their routes. It was the kind of ordinary morning most people would forget before lunchtime. Ethan Walker sat alone near the front window, holding a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. He preferred arriving early. Old habit. The city outside looked different now. Not perfect. No city ever was. But better. Assistance programs had been reorganized. Independent oversight committees reviewed distribution networks. Several executives had lost contracts and positions after the investigation concluded. Entire districts once ignored by the system had finally begun receiving the support promised to them. Progress arrived slowly. Yet it had arrived. The bell above the bakery door chimed. Ethan glanced up automatically. A group of schoolchildren entered wearing matching academy uniforms. They filled the room with energy before disappearing toward a row of tables near the back. One boy lagged behind the others for a moment. Dark hair, silver blue skin, bright eyes, healthy eyes. Ethan smiled before the child even noticed him. Nico froze. Recognition spread across his face almost instantly. Then he hurried across the bakery. Officer Ethan. Several customers turned toward the excited voice. Ethan laughed softly and stood just in time to catch the boy's enthusiastic embrace. Good morning, Nico. The difference was remarkable. The fragile child from the apartment barely existed anymore. He had grown several inches. His posture was stronger. His face carried color and energy. Most importantly, the constant shadow of exhaustion had disappeared. You are late, Nico declared. Ethan raised an eyebrow. For what? For breakfast. The boy pointed toward the counter. Lyra said you always arrive 10 minutes earlier. Ethan glanced at the clock. Apparently, I have disappointed everyone. Nico nodded with exaggerated seriousness. Very disappointing. Laughter followed from behind the counter. Ethan turned. Lyra stood beside a display case filled with fresh bread. A white apron covered her bakery uniform. Flour dusted one sleeve. Her silver blue hair was tied neatly behind her shoulders. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The years between that apartment and this bakery seemed to pass silently between them. She looked healthier too. Stronger. Not because life had become easy. Because hope no longer felt temporary. Good morning, officer, she said. Ethan shook his head. You know I am not on duty. Old habit, she replied with a smile. The morning crowd continued moving around them. Orders were called. Coffee machines hissed softly. Sunlight brightened the display shelves. Lyra disappeared briefly into the kitchen area and returned carrying a small paper bag. She placed it carefully on the table beside his coffee. Ethan opened it. Inside rested a single loaf of bread, fresh from the oven, still warm. The scent immediately filled the air between them. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. A loaf of bread. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing expensive. Yet somehow it contained an entire year. Lyra folded her hands behind her back. This one is paid for, she said quietly. Ethan looked up. Her eyes reflected the morning light from the front windows. There was gratitude there. Pride. Peace. Things that had once seemed impossible. Around them, the bakery continued its ordinary rhythm. Nobody noticed the significance of the moment. Nobody needed to. Ethan broke off a small piece and tasted it. Warm. Simple. Honest. Like the choice that started everything. Outside, the city carried on beneath a bright blue sky. Inside, silence settled comfortably between old friends. And for the first time, neither of them needed saving.